atomic clocks on our phone. We always get started at the correct time. Thank you all for being here this morning. My name is Dr. Randy Bertolis, and I've been Brennan Wrightsman's advisor on his honors project this semester. My wife worked for many years at the local elementary school, and she would come home and tell me who the good boys were and who the good girls were. And there's no question in my mind, based on my wife's descriptors, that Brennan is a good boy. He pops up at the oddest times on campus and in places you might not think about, and sometimes you don't even recognize him. But he's a fixture in our hallways. He's going to be a great social studies teacher in high school. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to the podium Brennan Wrightsman.
Thank you, Dr. Bertolis. So, my presentation is over military influences on Nebraska during World War II. So, when most people think about World War II, obviously people think about the actual battlegrounds that took place in Europe. Some people think about the home front, but lots of people don't think about Nebraska and the influences that Nebraska had on the war and vice versa, how Nebraska was influenced by the war. So, I'm going to focus on three different factors: military production within the state, POW camps that were held within the state, and then also Army Air training fields that trained pilots during the war. So I'll start with war production, and my first place with war production is the Hastings, if this thing decides to work.
You'll have to use the directional arrows on the laptop.
It's connected through this computer.
Use the mouse. Is there a mouse?
Yes. Or the keyboard. Look at this. Alright, so the Hastings Naval Ammunition Depot, it was a 76 square mile facility, which is around 49,000 acres. It was located just 1 mile east of Hastings, which is just on the south side of US Highway 6. The little photo right there kind of gives you just a basic layout of what the land structures were like within it. So the facility itself, it spanned between both Adams County and Clay County. Because of that southern tip, it just kind of barely dipped into Clay County there. It was chosen for a number of different factors. The first factor was just outside of Hastings, 3 railroad lines converged all just out on the outside of town. And during that point, rail was the primary transportation for goods and services at that point. So access to rail was a huge factor within this. So having those 3 rail lines that traveled within those lines throughout the country was a critical factor. The next factor was just the sheer amount of flat land that was accessible there. Everyone knows Nebraska. Lots of people like to call it the flat land nothing, but around here you have the hills. But down in the Platte River Valley, there is a lot of flat land, which made this super easy to build because they didn't have to worry about hills or anything like that within construction. So those are some of the factors on why it was chosen. So, construction, it started in July of 1942. So the construction crew itself was a 5,000 man crew. Most of them were a part of the Civilian Conservation Corps that during the Great Depression, they would travel around the country and do different construction projects to earn money. This was a federally started program that was a part of Roosevelt's New Deal. So it gave money to citizens in a time where they did not have a lot of money and there wasn't a lot of job opportunities due to the economic depression. So when the construction started in July, these construction crew, they lived in tents because there wasn't a whole lot of housing options within the town of Hastings itself. Throughout this whole time that the ammunition depot was operational, Hastings had this crazy housing shortage just because the sheer amount of workers that were there between actually employment within the depot and building the depot itself. There was a massive housing shortage. So during the summer, they lived in tents outside, and then once winter came around, Nebraska winters, it's not something that you want to live in a tent with that has no heat or anything like that. So what they did was they used Pullman train cars and they pulled them up to the ammunition depot site. and took them off the rail line. That way they were off the rail line on their own separate track, and workers slept in those until construction was done, just so that way they had a way to get out of the wind and stay warm. So after construction, production officially started about exactly 1 year later, on July 4th of 1943, nice and fitting. So production itself, while at its peak, it employed 125 naval officers, 1,600 enlisted men, which most of these enlisted men were African Americans, because during this time the Navy was still segregated. So instead of sending them overseas to actually fight in the war, they sent African Americans here to produce all of these naval ammunitions. And then at its peak as well, the Hastings Naval Ammunition Depot produced 40% of all naval ammunition that was used during the war. So it produced almost all of it. I mean, that's a huge, huge number. So it really produced a lot of it. So the site itself, it produced anything from bombs, shells, mines, torpedoes. It produced anything that the Navy could have used for munition itself. So it was spread across the facility itself, so obviously they're not going to have each factory on top of each other, because when you're producing munitions like this in this time period, any accidental spark, static electricity, or anything like that could set off a detonation that would just wipe out the entire facility. So during this whole process, they had to be very, very careful. So with the bunkers themselves that the munitions were held in after they were produced, before they got shipped out, the bunkers themselves, if you drive by them still today, they're still standing. They have this huge concrete fortress that sits above the ground, and then to make it safe, they covered the entire concrete portion with dirt and sod. So that way, A, it would kind of help force the blast shockwave and try to keep it within, and then they also covered it with dirt and sod because it kind of helps insulate that as well. So during the winter, again, since there's no heat in these buildings, they don't want it to get that cold, because otherwise that tends to ruin the munitions themselves. So covering it with the sod and dirt, it does help keep that core temperature within the facility itself kind of regulated. So yes, they were careful, but there were still 4 accidental explosions that were reported. The major one that actually had loss of life involved was on September 15th, 1944. 9 employees were killed and 56 were injured in the blast. And then right in the picture, it does have right where the explosion did happen, that circled area, that is where it occurred. So it started at that transfer depot. So transfer depot is where they take all the munitions that have already been made, packed, and ready to go. And that is where they loaded them up on trains and got them out to be used in the war. So while they were loading up some of this munitions, they made a spark out of somewhere, and somehow it ignited one of the shells and it exploded. And since it was in a transfer station and not in the bunker itself, it was out in the open next to a bunch of other munitions, so it caused a chain reaction, causing 9 million pounds of ammunition to explode. So it was one of the largest explosions ever to occur within the United States. So the shockwave itself was felt from 150 miles away. People from Omaha could feel the actual vibrations from the blast. Windows in Lincoln were cracked through the explosion. There was a huge chunk of that center area that you can see in that circle that was all decimated, that they had to completely rebuild and redo from scratch. Basements in Hastings, they were completely bowed, so they had people report of them going down to the basement afterwards, and they could see the actual concrete bowed in their basement. So it was a major blast that had a mean shockwave on it. So there were accidents, obviously, but this was the only one that actually recorded loss of life. So that's a little bit more of a benefit, especially since during this time period they did not have all the safety regulations that they do now. So this was a learning curve for some of those. So after World War II, production slowed. They obviously didn't need all the munitions that they were making after the war. So they slowed down production until the Korean War broke out, and then they ramped back up to full production that they were producing during World War II. And then once the Korean conflict was over, the Navy transferred their base in Hastings over to the Air Force, and the Air Force used it to test out new radar systems that they were using during the Cold War to help track Soviet planes. So people in Hastings used to report bombers flying over the city at the most random times of day because of this area trying to track these bombers in the sky. And the Air Force really liked this because there was still those munition bunkers there, so they could use electronic lasers to say, hey, we got this bunker, or you guys tracked us before it. So that's why the Air Force really liked it. But after several years, in 1958, it was just costing way too much money to upkeep this facility. So it was officially shut down in 1958 just due to costs. And then in the 1960s, Central Community College in Hastings now took out most of the land, and now Central Community College sits on this land along with the USDA, which has the major animal meat research facility. That is the major land holding today. But also within that land that's still around, like I said, Hastings Community College is still, not Hastings, Central Community College that's in Hastings. There is a golf course out there. The city of Hastings has their power plant out there as well. So it is still used, a lot of it is still government land, but some has been transferred back over to actual agriculture. So some of the effects, population change is by far the largest effect that the ammunition depot had on the town of Hastings. Before the ammunition depot came to Hastings, Hastings had a population of 15,000 people. After, in 1945, once the war ended, Hastings reported a population of 22,000 people. So it had a major population strike with people moving in to work at this new facility. So population change, that is the biggest factor. That is one of the biggest population jumps that Hastings has ever recorded. After that, Hastings is pretty much almost plateaued. Today it is about 25,000 people, so it has not grown very much since then. So that picture right there, that is what a bunker would look like from the backside. If you're driving along US Highway 6, you'll see the front side, which just looks like a giant hill. So if you drive ever east side of Hastings on Highway 6, trust me, they stick out. You'll see a bunch of hills pretty much that look like that all in a row. So you know something's there. So next is the Cornhusker Army Ammunition Plant. So this plant was a little bit smaller, and this one was run by the Army. So this one was about 19,000 acres, or about almost 30 square miles. This one was located west of Grand Island. The reason the Army chose this location for the plant is almost the exact same reason that the Navy chose Hastings. It had easy rail access. Just 6 miles outside of Grand Island, there are 2 major rail lines that cross, so it made ideal rail line access. There's abundance of flat land that they could get for relatively cheap due to the depression and land values, so they could get an abundance of flat land, and it had easy access to water. It was next to a nice population center, so there's plenty of people to work there as well. So construction started in 1942 in March. So this one was announced before Hastings, and this was the first ammunition depot with new specifications that had to be built. So right before World War II, in the 1930s, there was an ammunition depot that was run by the Navy in New Jersey, and it was on the dated side. Due to a lightning strike, a bunch of munitions ignited and blew up the entire facility. So after that happened, the military got together and decided that they needed new safety regulations when they build these new plants. So these new plants, they had concrete bunkers with blast walls in front of the door to force the explosion shock wave up instead of out, to help kind of eliminate chain reaction reaction explosions. Everything was built now with concrete and more fireproof materials, not wood like in the older style buildings. So this was kind of the military's test run on their new specifications, which really held up. So during production, it started in November of 1942. They absolutely flew on this construction project. They finished it in less than a year. So this one, since it was a little bit smaller, it didn't take as long to construct as it did in Hastings. At its peak, it employed 4,222 people. The Army did not keep as good of records as the Navy did on the breakdown of which were enlisted, which were officers, and which were civilians. There was just a base number of 4,220. And this facility only produced bombs for the Army. So unlike Hastings, where they produced tons of several different types of munitions, this one only produced bombs. So there were 4 different bomb loading lines, and the way they built the bombs then is you had an empty shell that was trained in, and then once they received the empty shell, they would pour liquid TNT into the shell, and then you would add a detonator, fuse, and sometimes if there was a propellant or anything like that, but very rarely. And once that was all packaged together, they were stored in the bunkers until they were able to train them out into the war. But again, not perfect. So there was only one recorded explosion though in this facility on May on the 26th of 1945. Again, 9 people were killed. This one was due to a lightning strike. It was in another transfer station. They were getting ready to load it up on a train, and the train was hit by lightning, and boom goes the train. So, but only 9 people were killed, so it could have been a lot worse, but this was the only recorded explosion, so they had a better track record than Hastings, but it is on the smaller side as well, so you don't have to deal with that as much size and as much production. So after World War II, this depot, it was shut down until Korea, just like in Hastings, and then after Korea, they shut it down again, and each time the government shut down this plant, it leased all the open land back to the farmers, so that way they could grow more crops and try and get more of an agriculture back into the economy like it was earlier. And then once Vietnam rolled around, it was reactivated again to make munitions, but then it was officially shut down in 1973 again, just due to cost, because these facilities and the upkeep that they had, they were super expensive, so they were trying to limit the amount of production facilities that they actually needed. So the effects from this plant, again, population jump was massive. So Grand Island itself had a population right before the war at 19,000, and then right after the war in 1945 it was recorded at 30,000, but Grand Island had more wartime effects than just this ammunition plant that I'll get into here in a little bit. Some of the land that this plant sits on is still unusable due to the harmful chemicals that it took to build these bombs. So the EPA has this labeled as a waste site, so no one can farm, do anything on these lands. Some of the land is used in a chemical fertilizer plant that is operational today that makes fertilizer for agricultural uses. And then the largest land holding is 1,000 acres that is set aside every year that holds our lovely Husker Harvest Days in September of every year. So next is the Martin Bomber Plant. This plant was announced in December of 1940. It was placed at Fort Crook, which is just south of Omaha. This was a 39-acre facility that had also 2 two-mile runways attached to it as well. So it was named Martin due to the Len Martin Manufacturing Company, which produced bombers after the Lend-Lease Act was signed in the 1940s by the U.S. government. And the Martin Manufacturing Company actually ran into issues because their original manufacturing plant in Baltimore did not have enough space to maximize their production. So they were looking for new places to build, and Omaha fit their criteria perfectly. Again, abundance of flat land, really next to a population center where they could have employees to work. And it this one was already a military installation, so they had some buildings set up already. So construction, it did start in December of 1940, and then the first actual bomber itself rolled off the assembly line in August of 1942. They started with the Boeing B-26 bombers because that was one of the more superior bombers at that time, but in 1943, the production facility was switched to start producing the new, far superior Boeing B-29 bomber. So the B-26 is this photo right here, and then the 29 is on the other side right over there. During this time, it employed about 13,000 people. It was a massive facility, and they had lots of production. During its overall use within the war, they produced almost 1,700 B-26 bombers and around 550 B-29 bombers. So they were cranking out these aircraft as fast as they possibly could. And then, so with all of these facilities, due to lots of the men being off fighting the war, women were used a lot to make up for this labor shortage. So in every single one of these manufacturing facilities, around 40% of these employees were women that were civilian workers. So women really came through and covered that labor shortage during the war. And this bomber plant had major impact within the war. It produced the Enola Gay, which was the B-29 bomber that dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, and it also produced the Boxcar, which was the other B-29 bomber that dropped the atomic bomb on Nagasaki. So this plant had major impacts within the war itself. It produced almost all of the B-29s that were used within the war itself. So it was a very impactful plant itself. So after World War II, it was transferred over to the Air Force with the creation of the Air Force, and Martin Manufacturing did not need a massive facility anymore. So it was transferred over to the Air Force, which then became Offutt Air Force Base, and it is still significant to this day because it holds the U.S. Strategic Command. So next, POW camps within Nebraska itself. So the way POW camps worked within the United States is there was a base camp, which was the larger camp itself where POWs were transported into, and then there were what we called satellite camps as well, which are smaller camps near the base camps where prisoners pretty much that had good behavior were able to go to these satellite camps because they were a little bit smaller. They were farther away from these base camps that didn't have as much military personnel within it. So there were 3 base camps within the state of Nebraska. There were about 12,000 POWs in Nebraska in all, and then all of these camps were forced to follow the Geneva Convention. So what that meant was no prisoner of war had to work. There was no forced labor. There were labor options, but it was completely voluntary. No one was forced to work. If there were any injuries or if they came in wounded, anything like that, medical attention was provided to make sure that they're healthy, food, they were fed, everything like that. So they had a nice, not nice, but a livable condition. So on these POW camps, there were many different activities. Like I said, work was one of them. Lots of these POWs liked the working aspect just because it gave them something to do during the day, so they didn't have to sit at this camp bored all day. And then during their free time, they had different sports that were going on. Soccer was huge, and then there were also different like community theaters within the camps themselves. So they would build their own sets out of cardboard and put on their own little plays. They had different like crafts that they would make, jewelry, picture frames, stuff like that. And a lot of the stuff that they made, they sent home to their families. But it wasn't all pretty. There was a lot of violence within the camps themselves. The violence stemmed within the prisoners itself. It wasn't the military guards inflicting the violence. It was prisoners inflicting violence on other prisoners. And this was most evident within the Germans. So the Germans, if they were still sympathizers to the Nazi regime. They would go beat the snot out of any prisoner that was a German that pretty much reformed more to the American ideals. So it was kind of their way of trying to keep their Nazi identity within the camp. It got so bad within camps that they had to start splitting those that were still Nazi sympathizers and those that were more reforming to American society. So that's why those satellite camps were in effect, because those that reformed more to those American ideals were able to get out of the base camps, away from the violence, and move into those satellite camps. So Camp Atlanta, this one was located just outside of Atlanta, Nebraska, which is about 8 miles southwest of Holdridge. This was the largest camp within a 9-state radius. It held about 2,700 prisoners, and they were all German POWs, and most of them were captured in the North Africa theater, but some were transported in later from the European theater itself. And this base camp had a huge satellite camp system. There were satellite camps that it had all over the state. The major ones that it held were in Hastings, Grand Island, and Kearney, just because those were the larger population centers near Holdridge. So these satellite camps, like I said, they're there to serve more as a safe haven for those American idealist type POWs, and they're also there on good behavior. So these labor details that they had while they were in these camps, most of it was agricultural help. Since the farmers that were home, they lost almost all of their farm help because their good farm help went off to fight the war. So these POWs were a good way to kind of supplement the farm help and kind of help the farmers out. And a part of the Geneva Convention is that they do get paid. So these POWs got paid. It wasn't in real currency though. It was what they called canteen coupons. So each camp itself had what they called a canteen, where they could buy little goods like snacks, drinks, paper, envelopes, stamps, so they could write letters home and stuff like that. So they worked for these canteen coupons, which they got about 70 to 80 canteen coupons a day. A piece of paper during that time was about 100 canteen coupons at that place. So you had to work at least a couple of days to get a piece of paper before you could send something home. So other camps, these camps were a lot smaller. First camp in Scottsbluff, this was the only camp within Nebraska to hold Italians. These Italians were captured during the North Africa campaign. According to a bunch of the officers that worked at this camp, the Italians loved this camp. They thought that this was much better than actually serving in the war and fighting the war. So there were reports of them coming into the camp singing, dancing, and whistling, which is a little awkward when you think about it because they're there in a prison camp. The other camp within the state is Fort Robinson, which only held about 600 Germans, but these Germans were a part of the elite Africa Corps in North Africa, which was a specialized division from Rommel. So these were very, very sympathetic to the Nazi regime. So they were pretty violent. They were not super happy campers to be there. So there was lots of violence within that camp. So that's why Fort Robinson stayed a lot smaller, because they could not handle any more due to just the sheer violence that was going on. So next and last, Army airfields. So right when America was dragged into the war, it was decided that the U.S. needed places to train pilots to go off to the war, because it was starting to become evident that this war was going to be won if you had significantly more air power than the other side. So Army decided that it needed more airfields to train, since during World War II, the Air Force was not actually established yet. Any air fighting was still done under the Army. So Nebraska itself was a prime location, again, for these kinds of facilities, because you need a lot of flat land to build runways and locations like that. So there were 11 different locations that were announced within Nebraska itself, and these are the locations there. So there were airfields in Ainsworth, Alliance, Bruning, Fairmont, Grand Island, Harvard, Kearney, Lincoln, McCook, Scottsbluff, Scribner, and Offutt. And so with it being training fields, crashes were not out of the ordinary. So crashes themselves, there were 56 that were reported within the state itself. Most of those were due to pilot error, again, because they were training, but 3 of them were due to weather, just due to high winds, because it's Nebraska. We do have some pretty high winds every once in a while. So most of it, though, was pilot error. So 241 men did lose their lives due to crashes. Most of these were aircraft, were P-47 fighters and B-17 bombers that did crash. So those green dots right on the map there are the different locations that there were reported crashes. And then the effects from these airfields, many of these did become civilian airports. So airports in McCook, Scottsbluff, Kearney, Grand Island, and Lincoln, these are all still around today, and there are civilian airports that service commercial flights. Lincoln is the only one that still has military ties with the Nebraska Air National Guard there and the refueling wing. With each of these little airfields, they did have economic booms for the town with the influx of servicemen coming in. There was nice economic booms. The towns really supported these airfields because they did bring in a good amount of money. The servicemen there is very active within the community, volunteering in theaters, different social clubs. They were always evident in parades. These airfields and the hangars, they held community events. So they were very well supported, but with the influx of airmen as well, it did bring in some issues. Alcohol-related incidents skyrocketed in all of the towns, as well as venereal diseases and prostitution. Those all ran rampant through these hometowns as well. So yes, they were bringing in some positives, but there were also lots of negatives as well that they did bring in. So in conclusion, World War II, it had massive effects worldwide, but it did have a lot of effects within Nebraska as well. All of these different locations that there were military installations and different facilities, every single one of those places saw population jumps due to the amount of workers that they had. Lots of them also received economic jumps as well, because with all of the people coming in, you have to buy food and all that kind of stuff. So it does jump your economy. And it did increase the infrastructure around the state as well, because with these new installations, you have to build roads to them, you have to build spurs for railroads. So it did increase the infrastructure as well. So before I open it up for questions, I do want to say thank you guys for coming. Thank you to Dr. Bertolis for being a very helpful advisor along the way. Thank you to my family for being super supportive as well. So I will open it up for questions if there are any.
Was there any recordings of like of the US like torturing these POWs in these camps?
No, so with the following of the Geneva Convention, they could not torture these individuals.
Oh.
Any other questions?
How important was it geographically to the military to just locate this stuff in the middle of the country? Why didn't they locate this stuff in North Carolina, Oregon?
So this was important to locate it in the middle of the country because this was the farthest away from both war theaters, so it kept all of the military man and air power from the other sides of war away from these installations. End up back there.
How many escape attempts do you know?
Escape attempts, there were 3 different escape attempts. One was from Fort Robinson. He was caught 2 miles away from the camp, and then the other 2 were satellite camps. One was in Grand Island. He was working a construction project and fled and was found trying to cross the Platte River. And the other one was in the actual camp, base camp itself in Atlanta. He had climbed a fence and gashed his leg on a barbed wire fence, and they found him a few hundred feet away with a bandage tied around his leg because he couldn't move any farther due to his injury.
Isn't another reason these POW camps are located in Nebraska because even if you escaped, where were you going to go?
So yeah, most of them, if they did try to escape, you try to get as far as possible, but again, like Dr. Bertola said, there's not lots of area of population or any easy way to really escape within those less population kind of sparse areas.
And isn't it true for some of these soldiers escaping from repressive regimes to Nebraska was so rewarding, they wanted to stay here after the war?
Yeah, so there were a few reports of POWs coming back, and then Camp Atlanta itself actually had a little reunion in the mid-1990s that a bunch of the officers came back and POWs came back, and they all saw each other because these communities, especially the Atlanta, was a little more tight-knit than the other ones within the state.